if the Ukrainians are going to be asked to surrender territory they currently control, then they're going to have something in return. You just cannot ask them to do that without something that would, in an extreme situation, justify that measure.
Hello and welcome to Independence Avenue Media. I'm Ia Meor-Mishole, and my guest today is John Lough, who is the head of foreign policy at New Eurasian Strategies Center. John, thank you very much for finding the time to talk to us today. What an interesting start of the week we had so far. We're recording this interview on the 17th of December, and I think it's important to mention the date because things change so fast now. So given what we know up until now, how would you assess the peace process? Do you think we're closer to peace in Ukraine?
Well, firstly, thank you so much for the invitation. It's really good to be with you and your audience. In terms of the peace process, I think we can say that this week some significant progress, I believe, was made on the Ukrainian, European, US side, if you will. And it was, for me, fascinating to see that some common ground was clearly found between the US and Europe on the much discussed issue of security guarantees. I'm very cautious when it comes to the use of the word security guarantee, because I think ultimately there is no guarantee as such of security. You can always put in place measures to deter aggression, be it by having your own armed forces equipped and trained to the right level, having solid relations with your allies. But I think it's much better to speak about a deterrent and what is it that it will take to deter future Russian military aggression. But be that as it may, I think this idea that there will be treaty-based commitments to support Ukrainian future, this goes way beyond the provisions of the Budapest, memorandum, which were simply security assurances written on paper. So this is very much what the Ukrainians have been asking for. And to see it emerging, for me, was frankly a little bit unexpected. I thought this would take longer. And this maybe signals the fact that Washington accepts that now the Europeans made clear, look, this question of surrendering territory, that's for Ukraine to decide. Nobody can decide that over Ukrainian heads. And
would you explain what the treaty-based agreement means versus maybe even compare it to the Budapest memorandum?
Well, it means that countries make a solemn undertaking through their parliaments. They sign an agreement that is then ratified by their parliaments that commits them then to provide support. This is how the NATO alliance works. And Ukraine has asked for something akin to Article 5 guarantees. That's from the North Atlantic Treaty. They want something that is solid and that countries simply cannot ignore. So they're then obliged by a treaty arrangement to respond to a certain situation. Now, I think one has to be cautious here. In the case of the North Atlantic Treaty, the member states are not committed as such to a military response. They're committed to a response. And it was always assumed in the Cold War, because of the scenario we faced at the time, that it would have to be a military response in the case of an armed attack. But in theory, it could be a political response as well. So, of course, with all these things, I keep having to tell people that the devil is going to be in the detail. What will it actually say in that agreement between Ukraine, the United States, Ukraine, and the United Kingdom, for example? What will it actually say? What will the United States, particularly this administration, commit itself to, since it wants to get away from these entangling alliances and is really turning on its head the way it manages relations with Europe? So it rather feels as though the US administration, this administration, has finally accepted that to achieve some form of peace in Ukraine is going to take a commitment that the US originally this administration did not believe it would have to make. Mm-hmm. So some people on the Ukrainian side have pointed out the irony that Washington doesn't want to stand by its NATO allies. We have, I think, more and more indications that the US is ambivalent about its NATO commitments, but it might be prepared to stand by Ukraine. So that's something of a surprise. If I just continue the thought, the real question here, of course, is how is Russia going to respond to this? And I think we can be absolutely sure from Putin's speech today to his defense collegium, a really militant speech, very critical of NATO, especially the European members of NATO. And he's firing a warning shot here to say that, although he didn't say it openly today, as far as I'm aware, I just read through the speech very fast before speaking to you. But clearly, Russia is going to reject this idea that there will be, for example, forces from European NATO countries stationed on Ukrainian territory, possibly even under some form of command system akin to NATO's. They're simply going to say that is a red line, it's unacceptable. And then that's going to put, I think, the Trump administration in this position again, where they have to think, well, how do we square the circle here? Does it mean to get to a peace agreement, we have to put yet more pressure on the Ukrainians and the Europeans? But I think we're kind of running out of road here. And maybe President Trump will have sort of one more serious go at this to see whether Putin really does want to settle the war or not, because Trump keeps saying that Putin wants peace. Putin wants peace on Russia's terms. He wants Ukraine to capitulate. And Ukraine is clearly not prepared to do that, I think, to my mind, despite the manifest problems in terms of manpower, the economic challenges they face, and simply the weariness of the country after nearly 4 years of war. The Ukrainians are prepared to carry on. And as some Ukrainians have said to me, in terms of this territory in Donbass that they're being asked to surrender, that they currently control, that they would rather fight for that and possibly lose it longer term rather than simply to surrender it.
So you're not very optimistic about the progress that's been...
I'm not optimistic there's going to be rapid progress. I think there may still be some progress here, because I think ultimately, despite Putin's rhetoric, I think that he is in more difficulty than it appears on the surface. Not only are there some economic problems, they're nothing like as serious on their own to make him change his calculus. But having to sustain losses of the kind they're suffering at the moment, to keep recruiting, soldiers, not that they care about these losses, but it's just a question of keeping the manpower at the necessary levels. If they're going to advance further into Donbass, if they're going to try to seize a major city, for example, they would have to mobilize. Another partial mobilization. The last time that happened in late 2022, about 1 million people left the country. It's an unpopular war. And I think importantly, he's set the expectation that this war is going to end soon. And I'm sure that both in the elite and in broader society, that's an idea that is welcomed, because people are tired of the war. So if he can't satisfy that, I think there are going to be many more questions asked about what's the point of this war? What are we getting out of it? And to use that, I think, nice Russian expression, just getting Donbass. I mean, that's like so Russians would say a suitcase without a handle. It's very heavy, cumbersome, and of extremely limited value. So I think there are a lot of questions still there to be answered. But it almost feels to me as though Putin has persuaded himself, perhaps has been told by his chief of general staff and by the military command, that it's all going well on the battlefield. The Ukrainians are not going to be able to keep going, and at some point very soon the front's going to collapse. But Putin's been saying this for about a year now, and the Russian army's taken nearly 4 years to seize 20% of Donbass, and they've got another roughly 20% to go. To conquer that territory, I'm not saying it would take them another four years, but I think it would take them a long time.
Ukrainians have been very active going after the refineries in Russia. Do you think that's having any impact on the Russian society's outlook on this war? Is it sort of trickling down that it's no longer a special military operation and our economy is really hurting because of this war?
Yeah, I don't know if the Russian population's sense is that the economy is really hurting,
Mm.
because all the indications so far are that Russian society has yet to feel the consequences of the war effort. So you've had this splurge of defense spending that has kept the economy afloat. Russia's still able to sell the volumes necessary of oil and gas to China, India, and others. Of course, the oil price is falling at the moment. The ruble, strangely, is appreciating. There's a budget deficit that's widening, and the effect of sanctions is more long term. Particularly their impact on certain technological sectors, which are really arresting the development of the Russian economy. There's very, very limited domestic and indeed foreign investment in the economy. China doesn't invest in the Russian economy to any significant degree, nor does India, for example. So that these problems are sort of building up. But in terms of increased taxation, I suspect that Russian consumers are probably going to start feeling this sort of slight sense of decline in the economy. But you've also interestingly got this one, so I suppose, social group that up until the start of the full scale invasion of Ukraine was not doing particularly well, and those are the people living in towns that had villages that had simply been a bit on the margins of the economic growth that Russia experienced in the early naughty years, when we had the commodity boom, sort of lost out. And suddenly the orders for defense industry have burgeoned. You've had these young men, or not always young men actually, men from the provinces, particularly the villages, going off to fight and being very well rewarded for doing so. Their families then generously provided for by the state when they die on the front. So that's brought money into another sector of Russian society that has benefited greatly. So it's a kind of mixed, very mixed picture. But it really doesn't feel as though in the big cities that people have been deprived of goods that make them think that suddenly that this war is a terrible thing, simply because the Russian economy and Russian importers have been very skilled at getting around sanctions. That's a problem with a lot of these Western sanctions, is that they're put in place but are then not adapted to close the loopholes. But where I think possibly Russian citizens have started to feel the war more is, certainly the diversification of targets now in Russia. The Ukrainians can strike much more widely and effectively. But the closure of airports on such a regular basis, that's a real indication to a certain class of Russians who are able to travel. There is a regular problem here, and the war's is not subsiding. In fact, these closures are becoming more frequent. And then you've got the mobile internet in places also being switched off on a regular basis. So this affects people's lives in a very practical way. But the message from the authorities, all the time from the Kremlin, is that this isn't going to last long. So I suppose the longer it continues, and the longer the Kremlin message is not congruent with the reality, the greater the likelihood of more dissatisfaction, both within the elite and within society more broadly.
I'd like to come back to the US's involvement in the process for this peace negotiations. Where do you think it's going to go from here?
Well, let's try to analyze it. I think President Trump has put an extraordinary effort into trying to move a peace process forward. He's invested significant political capital. that Alaska meeting, red carpet treatment for Putin, bringing him in from the cold, was a big risk, and it didn't pay off. And Trump had been led to believe that Putin was going to be more flexible. And instead, it seems he just got a restatement of positions he was familiar with. And that meeting, by all accounts, went badly. And you could see from Trump's body language that he was not happy during that press conference. But remarkably, he didn't give up. I mean, he imposed some sanctions on the face of it, if they were to be enforced, these sanctions on Lukoil and Rosneft, the increased tariffs on the Indians. These are things that certainly, if the sanctions are enforced, they would definitely put the Russian economy under more pressure. So it kind of looked as though Trump was getting fed up, and he needed to show a bit of steel and finally put some pressure on Putin, because it's never felt as though he really wants to pressurize Putin at all. He clearly seems in some way to be captivated by Putin, to admire him, and Putin, with all his skills as a KGB operative, I think has been able to exploit this sort of fascination he exerts on Trump. But we got to a point now where Trump has got the Ukrainians and the Europeans aligned with a US position. And we haven't had that so far. And so he's clearly going to think, well, the court's in, so the ball is in Putin's court now. And let's see how he reacts. I mean, he must understand instinctively that Putin's not going to like a lot of the things that have been agreed earlier this week. And the Russians have already signaled as much. But he thinks probably using a combination of his personal charm, the possibility that he could, in theory, impose more sanctions and make life more difficult for Putin, that he can somehow persuade him to show a degree of flexibility. And then if he can do that, then he would be prepared to go back to the Ukrainians and Europeans and say, look, this is the only deal available. You're going to have to make some more compromises. I got Putin to make, at least a modest compromise. Now you need to do more. But I still don't think this is going to be enough to really make a breakthrough. Mm. The danger for Ukraine is that Trump might just walk away, at least temporarily, and say, I'm done with this, you carry on fighting, but you're not going to benefit from US intelligence support, and I will also cut off deliveries of US military equipment bought by the Europeans. I mean, that would be an extreme position. But it sort of does feel a little bit this time as though we've got to the point where he's put as much pressure on the Ukrainians as he can. And President Zelensky is in this very difficult position now, because he might have to go to the country and say, look, this is the deal we have. I can get the guarantees. We can preserve Ukraine as a viable independent state. But to do so, we're going to have to change the borders. And this will be an immensely controversial issue within Ukraine. And he would, I think, almost certainly have to put this to a referendum. And then you have the question of, how do you actually hold a referendum in Ukraine in these conditions? Because just as it's a very disputed issue about whether you could possibly hold elections. I mean, how do you hold a referendum? So I think we've got some very difficult days and probably months ahead. And I think it's very important here to manage expectations. President Trump is a man in a hurry. I remember listening to General Kellogg earlier this year at the Munich Security Conference. And he said, memorably, we're going to be working on Trump time. And this, expectation that you can just get things done so very quickly that, the wars can be ended quickly. And apparently one of the things heard on the margins of the talks in Berlin earlier this week on the US side was that, the US side has now woken up to the fact that this is all really complicated and you can't get it done quickly. I mean, let's just think about the issue of the front line, of freezing the front line. We're not even talking here about, adjusting, borders or demilitarizing part of Donbass or something like that. I mean, just talking about freezing the conflict. How do you actually enforce a ceasefire? The US had talked earlier this week about leading a verification mechanism or establishing one. I mean, how on earth is this going to be done along such a wide front line? It's 1,000 kilometers or more. So, I mean, that's a huge logistical challenge to begin with. So you've then got the question of disengaging forces, getting them back, into probably some sort of demilitarized zone if you're going to do this. So this poses, to my mind, enormous problems.
Again, from the America's involvement in the process. So we initially saw Steve Witkoff going to Russia multiple times, meeting with President Putin. Then we saw Marco Rubio meeting with the Europeans and Ukrainians. It seemed like there were two parallel tracks working on this deal. And now we see Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner talking to the Ukrainians, and at least I have not seen Marco Rubio in this latest talks earlier this week. What do you make of that? Do we now have one process, and do you think the process is now more institutional? Because Marco Rubio got involved as the Secretary of State, and now he dropped out. So has he put the process back on the institutional track? Or are we still dealing personal diplomacy, basically, that Steve Witkoff was conducting with the Russians? Where does this stand?
Well, I'm not as close as you are to the Washington end, but it feels to me as though it's still, very much personal diplomacy, unconventional diplomacy, with all the problems that creates. But underlying it all is still this belief in the White House that it's commercial deals that can motivate all sides and sort of cut through some of these traditional problems involved in the diplomacy of bringing wars to an end. So I think this is a highly questionable approach in this war, and I think it fails to appreciate what the Russian motivations are here. And let's face it, that Putin is still talking about conquering all four regions of Ukraine and incorporating these into Russia and the Russian Federation proper, because they are, in his view, historically Russian lands. So I don't see that he, for example, Putin, would somehow be deviated from that course by the prospect of some rare earths deal with the United States. Much as he would like to have US sanctions lifted, to have some sort of normalization of US-Russia relations, and of course would like to use that to further drive a wedge between the US and Europe. I still don't think that he's going to be deviated from what he clearly sees as his historical mission.
I do appreciate your time. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you.
You just watched that interview with John Lough. He's the head of foreign policy at the New Eurasian Strategies Center. If you like our interviews, do subscribe to our YouTube channel so you never miss an interview, and follow us on social media wherever you are on social media. Thanks again for watching, and see you next time.